Let me read to you a couple of verses. It's in Matthew 13. I think I'm on. Am I on? I am on. I'm not. I am on.
Yes. I can hear you.
Okay.
You're on.
Thanks for sitting at the best spot that I'm staring straight into the sun. No, it's good.
You're welcome.
Okay. Jesus he became a rabbi. He was Adam mentioned that they'd learn from their teacher and they'd follow their teacher and well-known rabbis. Jesus was a traveling rabbi going from town to town, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But before he was 30, he did what everyone did. You followed in your father's footsteps. How many of you are in a profession very similar to what your dad did? Okay. Tell me what it was. What was your dad's profession that you do that's something similar?
I'm in the investment financial services.
Okay. Yep. Who else? What about you, Tracy?
Well, my dad was a dentist. I'm a nurse.
Okay. Yep. In the medical field. Who else?
My grandpa was a stonemason from France, and then it went to my dad, and now it's to me. So it's a stonemasonry company.
Wow. Okay. That's awesome. Did I see somebody over here?
Yeah.
What do you got?
I was an insurance agent. My father was an insurance agent. My brother was an insurance agent. My grandfather was an insurance agent.
I think he wins the prize. Geico. That's good. Stop your swearing. Okay, Matthew 13. Jesus, you read it over and over in the Gospels. And this is one example. Matthew 13:55. Matthew 13:55 says this. When Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, what was his hometown? Okay. Yes and no. This one is. It's really an interesting. It became Capernaum. So he grew up in Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth, but then he made his new hometown Capernaum, and that was his base. And we'll see that tomorrow morning. Came to his hometown, began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and his miraculous powers? They asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? So Jesus comes back to Nazareth, not home base, but hometown, teaches, they all recognize him, and they're kind of, impressed. He's teaching with incredible wisdom. He has these miraculous powers. How is this possible? And they said, isn't this the carpenter's son? So Joseph is a carpenter, and Jesus, in that day, you'd follow your dad's profession. So sometimes it says the carpenter's son. Other times it says that Jesus was a carpenter. So we see this description in the Gospels. And I want us to think about this a little bit. About the age of 13, you'd enter into your father's business. So Peter, James, and John, their dads were fishermen. They'd leave you talk about the sons of Zebedee, leaving their dad's fishing business and following Jesus. It just was the normal thing in that culture. Mark 6 takes the same story and indicates that some were saying, isn't this the carpenter? So not just the carpenter's son. Mark 6:3 isn't this the carpenter? And when our girls were little, we read to them from children's Bibles, and you always can, near Matthew 13 or Mark 6, you could see some picture of childhood Jesus or teenager Jesus or Jesus in his 20s with his father, sawing something, building I don't know why it always seemed to be a table and a chair. I'm not sure why that was in those Bibles, but the question is that accurate? And I think we have a slight misunderstanding here. We're going to talk today and tomorrow about some English translations. When sometimes the first translator into a language isn't always the best translation because we get more information. It gets better and better as we go. But sometimes the first translation has incredible power, and sometimes when they don't translate something perfectly, it hangs on. Generation to generation, and translation to translation. And I don't blame early translators. Early translators hadn't been to Israel. They didn't know certain things. And you'll learn more about, and any of you that have studied language, not just know another language, study how a language develops. When you're figuring out definitions for words, you do it by context. You don't find a dictionary that says, here's what this word means. You see the context. So the word for that we translate, the early English translations and most current English translations translate carpenter is actually the Greek word tekton. And in almost every English translation, going all the way back to the King James, that is translated as carpenter. But as understanding of Greek language developed, it really you can translate it carpenter, craftsman, builder. You mentioned stonemason, all from that same word. Someone who's working with their hands. But carpenter definitely fits that description. But check out the area. When you look around, what do you not see a ton of?
Trees.
Yeah.
Wood.
We got a problem. If Joseph and Jesus were carpenters, they were starving carpenters. People, certainly they would work with wood, but there's some things that we kind of take for granted. One is that people were wealthy enough that they could specialize. People didn't say, I work with wood. No, they were a builder. Think about, just a general contractor. I do it all. Versus the person that does, I only do framing. That's what I do. In a culture that you're living hand to mouth, you're saying, you got a project, I can do it. And if you live in this area, if you say, no, I only do carpentry, well, you're not doing it for long. Because that is the topography you see is the topography around here. So one expert said that 9 out of 10 projects that a tekton would take on would be with stone, not with wood. And we'll see that tomorrow. Majority of the homes that we will see are made out of stone. They're not made out of wood. The roof structures may be made out of wood. And at different times they might be stone, but a lot of times they're wood. So we are, as Adam mentioned as we were pulling in, we are looking at Cana. On the other side of Cana is Nazareth. We are about 3 or 4 miles from Nazareth. This is Jesus' stomping grounds growing up. And what's interesting about this town, Sepphoris, or that's what it was called then, Zippori now, is Sepphoris was, in the first century, this was called the capital of Galilee. And Herod put a lot of money into this. Josephus called this the Jewel of Galilee. And there was massive building projects going on in the first century here. So one of the questions we don't know is how Joseph ended up going from Bethlehem to Nazareth, right? Joseph, we know, is from Bethlehem. How do we know he is from Bethlehem?
That's where he went.
Yeah, that's where he had to return for the census. Exactly. And he is a descendant of whom? David. And Bethlehem is the town of David, the city of David. So somehow in there, and if you remember Old Testament law in the year, oh, hey, look at that, right there. Don't move your head one way or the other. We're perfect. And if every 50 years is the year of Jubilee. So land, when God gave the people the land, he wanted them always to know that it was a gift from him. So if I'm really poor and I am in some financial trouble and I own a piece of land and I owe John money, I might sell my land to John, but when the year of Jubilee comes, John gives me the land back. He doesn't sell it back to me, he gives it to me. And even if we're in year 48, in 2 years, he's given my land back. Why? God said, this is my gift. You don't own this land, it's my gift to you. So somehow, Joseph, how many descendants back came up to Nazareth? One suggestion is some scholars would say, perhaps they came up here because this is where the work was. Because this became the Jewel of Galilee, it became the capital of the Galilee region, and Herod poured a ton of money into this place to build it up. And so it is very reasonable to imagine that Joseph would walk, and by the way, between Nazareth, 3 or 4 miles that way, and Sepphoris, there's a rock quarry. So it is very reasonable to travel 3 or 4 miles every day by foot to do a job, to do work. Nazareth was always a small town. You're talking a few hundred people. This was much, here, this is the theater. So again, if the average Roman world was 10%, they want 10% of the city to be able to fit in the theater. This is a lot larger than Nazareth. And this gives you, I told you before that In Caesarea, that was, you could tell this is all redone for us, but that's what it was. So when they discovered this archaeologically, that's what it looked like, and they pieced it together to make us feel more, and to be able to use it for plays and such. So this is what they've done more recently. That's what it looked like up there. You can see the stairs kind of behind you that would be seats as it's worn away. So you could fit a lot of people in here. And so when Joseph was working, there just was a ton of work here. And it's not unreasonable to imagine that Jesus is coming here as a young boy playing while his dad. This theater was built, I think the sign said first century, maybe early second century. But certainly there's pieces of this city that Joseph maybe very well have been a part of building. It's a significant city. It's nothing like Caesarea, but in the first century it was something. It was good for Galilee. So Joseph was a tecton. He was a stonemason. He was a builder. Did he work with wood? Probably. But to read the word carpenter, one of my goals for you is that when you're reading your Bible and you see that Jesus, is this not the carpenter's son, that in your mind, you don't have to correct everyone who says it because they're reading from a pretty good translation. But in your mind, just think, okay, someone who works with their hands. He's a stonemason. He's working with whatever is around. And by the way, just listen to some of the words of Jesus, because you'll notice Jesus talks a whole lot about stones. He doesn't talk a lot about wood. He talked a lot about the material he likely worked with for 30 years. So listen to just some passages maybe you've heard before that may make more sense. And just knowing that the terrain, we came from some of the very wooded areas. We came from, the Old Testament talks about the beauty and the lushness of Carmel. Just pay attention the next 8 or 9 days. How often do you see forests of trees? That is just not as common in what we'll see. But listen to some of the things Jesus would say. Examples, Matthew 3:9. Do not think you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. Again, he didn't say out of these trees. It's what was around him. Why did Jesus say that? Because they were surrounded by stone, not wood. How about Matthew 4:3? The tempter came to him. If you were the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Didn't say cause these trees to become bread, it's stones. Matthew 21:42. Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it's marvelous in our eyes. Or Luke 19:40. I tell you, if they keep quiet, the people that were praising Jesus as he came down the Mount of Olives, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. English translators of the Bible, when they thought about building, it's kind of like us. If someone says, well, I work with my hands, we probably assume they work primarily with wood in our culture. Well, if someone said that 2,000 years ago in Israel, they work with their hands, you'd say, oh, you're a stonemason. That's what you do. So you could just hear the examples over and over are with stone. They're not with wood. By the way, I think that helps shed a little bit of light on Jesus' physique. Have you ever met anyone that worked with stone all their life? I'm telling you, Jesus was not this wimpy, frail, skinny man that sometimes he's designed to be. Jesus was jacked, I'm telling you. He was built. It's this effeminate image of Jesus who's really weak and frail is not accurate. He likely worked with stone the first 30 years of his life. And anyone that's lifting stone and moving it and chiseling it has plenty of muscle. So when you read of Jesus being a carpenter in our English translations, just think stonemason, or at least think builder. Just replace it with builder. Again, is carpenter an accurate translation? Yes, of course. But it's one of the casualties of sometimes the earliest of translations wins out. And future translations just stick with it. And that's an example. One other thing I'll mention here. Jesus had a favorite word for the Pharisees. Anybody, what's a word Jesus loved to use for the Pharisees?
Vipers.
Vipers, what else?
Blind fools.
What is it?
Blind fool.
We got blind fools, what else?
Whitewashed tomb.
Whitewashed tomb, good, what else? Hypocrite. Yeah, hypocrite, that's probably the most common. He used all of those phrases, hypocrite, was a very common one. What's interesting is hypocrite came from the Roman theater. So this is a Roman theater. The word hypocrite is our word actor. And in the Roman theater, when they would act, they would stand on the stage and they would play a part. Very different, and it's easy to have as you hear me talk about chronological snobbery, like, ooh, that seems weird. But they wouldn't just play a part by who they are. They would hold a mask in front of their face. It actually allowed them to have fewer actors in a theater troupe, because then they'd wear one mask and then they'd go backstage and come out with a different mask on, and those actors were called hypocrites. You're playing a part. It's not who you really are. What's interesting is religious Jews thought that the theater was very vile, and if you were devoted to God, you would not go to the theater. So it's interesting to me that Jesus, who grew up in this very Roman city, and perhaps there was an earlier theater before this, if this was built after Jesus, that theater was just part of Jesus' life growing up. And so he uses, it's funny to me, I think it reveals part of Jesus' sense of humor, is that he chooses to use a word from the Roman theater that was incredibly insulting to them, because they would never, ever go to the Roman theater. And then he said, no, actually, you're the people on the stage. You're playing a part. It's not who you really are. It's just, I just think that's revealing of who Jesus is and how he was so kind and gentle with those who knew they were sinners, and so harsh with those who were self-righteous. But Jesus, when he gives illustrations, he gave it from what was around him. And what was around him was stone. And he talked about that. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. If these people stop crying out, the stones themselves will cry out. Jesus, the tecton. The carpenter, sure, but more likely the stonemason. If you have to get one word, I would bet we will find out one day that the most common work that Joseph and Jesus did was stonework, not working with wood. So, I hope that even doesn't help you just when you read the Bible, but even when you hear things and when you sing songs, the emphasis of who Jesus is. So we're going to sing one. We've been singing at New Heights for quite a while, but it reminds us not just of who Jesus is, but of what his profession was. So open your lyrics and let's sing Cornerstone together.